Hello and welcome to the Webo Bubble, a podcast about deep topics and taking only a mildly deep approach in order to ask questions about the concepts here and there implied. We are going to delineate on the theory of freedoms. In particular, we will be discussing a particular case and why it doesn't amount to actual freedom of speech. The first kind of thing we must add to this discussion is that while we love nuance here at the Webo Bubble, it is a thick blanket in which we attempt to encase ourselves. We delineate between night and day actual racism, and we do not attempt to defend such shenanigans because it's just plain wrong. We mention this now because we're going to talk about a racist and to describe why people are attempting to defend it as sarcasm and why it isn't, and to say why, one, that's dangerous, and two, why it's patently untrue. Okay, so a little backstory. There's a game. It's a tabletop army game called Warhammer 40,000, or Warhammer 40K is a common abbreviation. It's operated by a company called Games Workshop. They were having a crossover promotion for a new content pack in the video game World of Warships. And this content creator, formerly known as Arch Warhammer, was sponsored by World of Warships with this Games Workshop license. Also, obviously, because they have a game called Warhammer 40K, they have a trademark on Warhammer. And so this image now on screen is, at the time, Arch Warhammer's political not even political, opinion on persons of color and different ethnic groups other than his own. He is Norwegian. So what happened was, once this got released, World of Warships removed their partnership with them, at which point they admitted that it was an unintentional partnership because Games Workshop had already told them that this guy was trouble due to previous videos of him being pretty borderline racist. He has a political channel as well. His main channel has 200,000 subscribers, so it's little, but not really. And then Games Workshop moved to initiated a copyright strike so that he had to change his name from Arch Warhammer to Arch so that he would not look associated with their product. Okay, so the first thing people will say is, well, that's free speech. Well, it's not, because it's not a government doing it. It's using a legal structure which is set up by a government, but that itself is not the government. Okay, now let's assume for a second that Games Workshop is somehow attached to a government. There are limits on speech. First of all, for instance, you can't scream fire in a movie theater. Why? Because people would get hurt trying to escape it. That was what, these weren't very well lit. They were poorly ventilated. They had like one exit and it wasn't very well marked. And it's dark, and actual film back in the day would burn. So you can't have people just shouting fire because there'll be a panic and someone will die. That's the basic part of that law. Right? Well, there's also hate speech laws. Now, I don't think this amounts to hate speech, but it's definitely on the road to hate speech, in which you can make an argument for it. And again, Games Workshop and World of Warships are not in any way, shape, or form actually connected to a government, so they are well within their rights to use their own freedom of association to then say, we don't agree with your opinion. So that's why that argument is wrong. The actual argument that Arch attempted to use to defend him, and apparently he maliciously complied somehow by changing his name, and now he makes videos about how salty he is and how Games Workshop is secretly in bed with China, i.e. the Chinese government, even though they have actual anti-modern slavery policies. That's kind of cool. Now, do they produce things in China? Well, yes, but they also have to pay them, and all their vendors actually pay people a fair wage. So is that therefore being in bed with the Communist Party in China? Probably not. But his defense is, well, because they're only enforcing it on me, and there's all these other content creators that use their trademark in effect, that they have not defended their trademark, therefore they've lost it. Well, the problem with that is a trademark, hashtag not a lawyer, I'm not, he's not, However, I'm not going to talk about specific parts of the law, which he's trying to. What I'm going to talk about is the theory that sets up the law. And it was that theory of trademark law is these are a quality control to ensure that basically you approve of this product being sold, right, as the big scary company. And back in the day, that obviously meant, my word is my bond. That meant a lot, and it still does. And so trademarks, though, are generally only enforced if there's a reason to enforce them. So because he made it be because he was racist, that created a problem, and that's why it actually, had to be enforced. And, he's trying to make a very black and white legal argument, and he might have a case, but he probably doesn't. And the law is very gray. So to say that he should or shouldn't have is a little bit presumptuous on our part. However, we find that it is, for the most part, him reaching because he's mad about this. And this is the only case he's made in this defense. Okay, so first we're going to talk about his comment in the top left about people of African descent not being able to find their own history. Well, first of all, that's wrong because we can just look and find African American history, not necessarily on the specific case, because slavery makes that difficult, especially when you don't have good records, because when people are property, they don't have names, and those records may not have survived or are purposely repressed and suppressed. And the other part is pre-civil rights movement, people were suppressing African American history. Now we name a few. To point this out, we say why this is a bad argument on his part. Look, Martin Luther King Jr., pretty easy case for that's African American history at the removal of the repression that was keeping it back. But we also have individuals like George Washington Carver, fairly well known, a little bit too interested in legumes, but these some things. Pretty all right guy. We'll let his love of peanuts slide. Next one is an actual example of sarcasm from Chris Rock in 1996. On a subculture within impoverished African American communities, which was hyper-masculine, just like fascism. This is kind of, part of, like, you're advocating for a system that's hyper-masculine there, Arch, and therefore, then this system actually, in a sarcastic sense, you agree with, which just shows that you don't understand what sarcasm is. So that's why that in particular case is also, this one is also bad sarcasm. And it's also way out of context. The Maji event, which is what he's referencing with the water. It's got a bunch of different names. It's also the Maji Jihad. The problem with that is traditional African religion or religions, because it's both one and many at the same time. Similar things with defining language on the African continent. Is there like 500 or 5,000? Because there's the blur between language and dialect and religion and sect are very murky, and therefore it's hard to. But basically, Islam was, was a thing in the East German Africa, which is where the majority of the Maji incident took place, and it has connections with that. So while is it Muslim like practice in Saudi Arabia? Well, is it Islam practice like it is in Saudi Arabia? No. Are they Muslims like in Saudi Arabia? No. They have other gods and different things, and it's very different. And basically, in the early 1900s, there was a revolt, and there actually weren't so much using the symbolism of this unified religion or the shared religious values as an actual belief necessarily, although, true, the stated belief was, the German bullets will turn to water because of our magic. Obviously, they really knew that wasn't true because this went on for some time and there were multiple engagements. So they knew it didn't work, but they continued to do it. Ergo, they didn't actually believe the water would work. But what it was a unifying element. It was something everyone could rally around. For example, in the American Revolution, American Crisis, written by Thomas Paine, and Common Sense, also written by Thomas Paine, and then the Boston Massacre, and the portrayals of it in newspapers were something soon-to-be Americans rallied around. But it wasn't necessarily true. The Boston Massacre was 5 people, This was not like a huge, oh my God, they kept shooting, and obviously those soldiers were acquitted. So to say that, oh my God, it's so stupid for them to believe that. Well, if we look at currently the most powerful nation on the planet, part of it why it exists is because people were irrational and believed in this unifying kind of concept. So yes. Okay, the next point we're going to address is the comment on what I think he's referencing is Africa in general. So sadly, it was true that if any form of slavery existed, but we're looking at antiquity currently, and in West Africa, which is where the majority of African slaves came from, you were captured not by Europeans but by fellow Africans. You were then sold probably multiple times, in most cases, and you transitioned from being sold in a non-cash economy, so much more a trade and barter system, to a cash economy when you got closer to the small colonial forts, possessions, etc. on the coast in which you were traded. So what does this mean for us? Well, these 2 points are kind of true, but they also are omitting the fact that, this was what we call taxes in persons or labor in persons. So yes, it existed and was done by all manner of communities. It was much more, especially when the first time you were captured, it's much less generally about, chattel slavery and much more about taxation so that everyone would grow yams. For example, in Things Fall Apart, which is a good novel, and I highly recommend it. This is one of the discussion is how he started as a farmer and then became a fairly influential one as basically not quite a slave, but a sharecropper in effect. And that was a form of not total slavery, but partial slavery. And again, that's that taxes in persons. And then we come to why it's wrong that they were not liberated, quote unquote, by white people. In large part, they're liberated by themselves. So in the late 1800s, you have the scramble for Africa. So point number one to why white people did not just, quote unquote, liberate them. Now, then slavery obviously was technically abolished. Even prior to the scramble for Africa, slavery was technically abolished in many of these European nations, but it really wasn't. Obviously, these people weren't treated like human beings. The Belgian practices in the Congo illustrate this perfectly. That cutting people's hands off because they failed to meet a rubber quota, and not even like they agreed to it via contract under the threat of other bodily harm. They failed to meet a rubber quota that was unfairly set to begin with. Okay, so that's the problem. Then we look at when did African nations gain freedom, and it wasn't because European nations didn't want to let go of their colonies; they wanted to keep them. But the decline of empire and the decline of the economic status of France, Great Britain, Portugal really enabled these colonies to gain their independence. Now, the French in particular, and the way they did it was very much showing that they wanted to retain their colonies. Because when the French left most of these places, they took everything they built with them, everything built by a French person with them. And this is still a problem to this day. So post-1960, which is when most of these states gained independence, they, are still suffering from the problem which they suffer to this day to greater or lesser extent, which is neocolonialism. And basically what that means is, yes, the countries have stopped pillaging them, but the countries still haven't stopped their companies from pillaging them. So we can look at precious metal extraction in the Congo and the extreme methods used there by different groups that we're totally fine with. Everybody buys the new iPhone. No one cares that, it costs an arm and a leg, in some cases, literally. We look at Nestle, who for a long period of time was giving away free formula for babies in West Africa. And they basically waited till they knew that most mothers that had infants that required, formula milk, breast milk, when the mother's milk had dried up. And then they started charging money for it, and it was extortionist. That's neocolonialism. Now, the other argument that sometimes you hear get made is the apologist argument, and sometimes the undevelopment or de-development argument. Apologism is basically saying, well, but we built all these railroads and things. And yes, you did, but that was to extract, raw materials. It wasn't to help these people. These weren't pro-movement. These weren't, great liberal public works projects. These were repression, effectively. And then you have the de-development or undevelopment people that say, well, you just pillaged us and you gave us nothing, which isn't quite true either. But that's still a problem. So, these are actual things. Okay, so then next we move to something about an author of Asian descent. And this is not, it's not an actual criticism of the work, it's an attempt to criticize the person, which just shows you that's called an ad hominem attack, which shows you it's one, wrong, two, invalid as an argument form and logical argument, and three, just distasteful. You can call out a bad person for being a bad person, but it's something else entirely to attack something they have no control over. And that actually has no effect on the work whatsoever. Okay. Then you have this little comment about, locust. So what this is really a marrying of extreme right, fundamentalist Christian, and extreme right, fascists trying to kind of talk about oh, this is from God, they're punishing China. Well, no, actually, the outbreak of locust primarily is in Pakistan, first of all, and secondly, it's only going to affect Chinese food supplies, and third, this happens on a regular basis. Okay, now we're going to address the one about the Sami, because it seems more appropriate. We're grouping them together as best we can. So the Sami are a tribal people, and, well, nomadic. Tribal is a complicated word. So basically you have nations at the top. So the German nation refers to everyone that speaks German or is ethnically German. So that includes Austrians, that includes Liechtensteiners, that includes a lot of Swiss people, etc. And then you have the tribe, which would be a subgroup. So, for instance, Westphalians or Berliners or these other groups. Then you have, bands and clans, which are even smaller subgroups. So that would be like a city. And then you have family units, extended family units, and then lastly you have the person. So tribal is obviously problematic, and that ties into historic racism because we don't want to call them nations. We want to call them tribes because that somehow makes them lesser. Cool, right? Okay. So the Sami basically still are actually able to move around through Norway, Sweden, and Finland, Russia. These are the very far north places. They herd caribou and reindeer and do all these other cool things, living way up where it's very, very cold. And in the 20s and 40s, and for brief periods in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Russia's history, it was legal to shoot these people. And that was wrong. And the suggestion that they were doing this right in the 20s and 40s is wrong. And again, Holocaust not so nice. But also, people don't understand that, and we would like to point this out to this individual Arch, the washed up fascist that they put in to power at the end of, when Norway fell to Nazi Germany, was executed, and he was the guy that Norway brought the death penalty back specifically for after the war. So just goes to show that most people don't agree with your opinion there. All right. Now on to Star Wars. I'm not actually sure what he's referring to, but let's suggest that first of all, this individual is transgender. Now, obviously, no one thinks Quasimodo is like a beautiful individual, at least physically. But actors, one, are not generally ugly people, but two, more importantly, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and attractiveness as well. So we cannot say that, oh, she's ungodly ugly. Well, yes, but probably no. And that's at the very best just your own opinion. And while you have you're allowed to say that, you don't have to just then say it's because of this factor. It could be for a variety of factors. And if that one's the one in particular question, you have to identify, well, this is my particular opinion, and not that this should be the totality of the opinion about this person. And more importantly, it's not actually, again, addressing the work, it's addressing the person. So it's, again, another ad hominem attack.
And again, it's you're turning a performer, and you're not taking it, what the performance is. You're turning them into an undesirable object, which just shows like how bad that is. Okay, so now I'm gonna read the last one because it's particularly interesting and it's particularly hypocritical. Real fascism leads to a utopian state where every member is both spiritually and physically fulfilled, while living in as much luxury as the state can possibly afford. Okay, so first, let's address that. In a fascist state, companies have more rights than persons. We suggest, if you want to learn more about what it actually is to grow up in a or to be against a fascist state, even we're the most benign one, we suggest Christ Stopped at Eboli by Carlo Levi, the basic plot of which is what fascism was during Italy, which was the North exploiting the South. Now, obviously, the Italians didn't really have the political will to mass genocide their political rivals, as did the Nazis, the Antifa movement, obviously being the first group sent to the death camps. But what they did do instead was they just exiled people, and so Carlo Levi was actually exiled. He changed the names of places, but this is an actual region, and it just shows how fascism, not ideal. But more importantly, we look at the authoritarian systems of colonial rule in Africa, and we point out that they took legal systems, which in European law are negotiable, they're flexible, there's lots of shades of gray, and they turned them into very much black and white systems that operated on, quote, tribal law to repress people and to make it so that nobody actually had recourse. And in South Africa, apartheid stayed in place till 1991, and it was a thing that really did repress people. For reading on that, we suggest Kingdom of the Lost, which is another great book. And I won't try to pronounce the author's name because I can't. I just know when it's said, and I don't try. So yes, but okay. Why do people think it's okay to defend Arch and all this other stuff? Well, more importantly, why do people think that it's all right to argue for fascism? Well, they're allowed to, but only in actual public platforms. And the problem with fascism is it is inherently racist. There are inherently in-groups and out-groups that are repressed based on superficial factors or just disagreeing. And some people think that that's the way to go, true. But most people also don't understand the actual parts of it that are evil. They think, oh, this person kind of agrees with me, and maybe I don't quite agree with the majority of what we might call cancel culture, but these anti-disestablishmentarians really do kind of execute actions in a way to repress people, to attempt to say, no, you're not as good as me because your skin color is different, because that makes sense. But another reason, and I don't mean to insult people's intelligence, is Arch in his lore videos sounds generally intelligent, and it's really easy to do that when you can read off a wiki. And the other thing about Warhammer is you can just make things up, and because the famous quote is, everything is canon, nothing is true. So it's really easy to sound intelligent when you can just make up things. But generally, that's, people think he sounds intelligent. Well, so this is an intelligent person. He sounds like he's making a legitimate logical argument. He's not, but he sounds like he is. So that's kind of a thing. And so, then you look at other, more negative aspects of the opposite, right? The cancel culture. And so the targeting of D&D, well, we want D&D to change the dark elves that live underground, enslaving people who worship a blue spider lady. And by the way, they're not actually dark. They're like purple, and like they can be white too, and have super blonde hair, all of them, and red eyes mostly. That a little bit of an overreach there generally, and that's kind of a thing. Now, does what Art said amount to hate speech, which is what some people have said? And no, it doesn't. It's on the road to it, and we draw the line, at least in this in the court of public opinion, much further up the road than in the legal court. right? Because obviously you can't incite violence against a person. If you do so because of their race, religion, etc., you've committed a hate crime. If you just threaten them in general, that's still also a crime if it's a credible threat. Now, we do this in the court of public opinion earlier so that we can, defend our democracy, not just in the legal court, but stopping these kinds of opinions from being harmful and causing harm in in the sphere of the economy and business and social life and just in general. And so we mean to furnish an example of this, right? Okay, so free speech. For instance, you could criticize President Obama for any one of his policies, and they would be perfectly valid criticisms. We do not mean to suggest that this is Webo Bubble's opinion. We mean to just suggest that you can do so. Where that no longer applies in the court of social opinion and the court of public opinion, said another way, is when you attack his ethnic heritage, that being originally his of Kenyan origin. Now he himself was born in Hawaii. That birther movement just proves why this is, one, dangerous, and two, really, really evil. But then, where does it apply in the legal? Well, if you called for violence against the president, well, the former president now, because of his ethnic heritage, that would be a hate crime. And that's, the progressive drawing the lines. And we think it's important to continue this delineation and to continue to attack people in the court of public opinion. Now, if we might be allowed a small suggested reading list to actual oppression, what it looks like, especially pre-civil rights movement, we suggest Black Boy. Great little book. It's not actually little. It's fairly short, but it's a good read. Kingdom of the Lost, Things Fall Apart, which we've already recommended. We recommend also A Raisin in the Sun, the play, or the book. Both work. And, Night by Eddie Voight-Zell, great book. This Way for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, fairly good. A little bit darker, and it's talking about the Holocaust, so how can it be more dark than normal? Well, it manages to find a way, don't worry. And goes in more a little bit about the technical social engineering that the Nazis were doing within the death camps, having 39 different symbols for different peoples so that they couldn't effectively form a collective identity and therefore have better resistance. This is kind of the thing. You have Eichmann in Jerusalem, which talks a lot about it. Now, it talks about, was the abduction of Eichmann legal? Well, no. Does anyone care? No, because he was a Nazi. Everybody pretty much agrees that 8 feet of rope was too good for this guy. Now, the author of that particular case, Hannah Arendt, her lover was in fact a Nazi, and she was, in fact, her professor in 20 years difference, and she hid in the United States, so her opinion, while very much harmed and very informative, may not be in line with someone who actually went to the camps. And then her and her lover, obviously, after the war, continued to be a thing and never got married, which is also kind of interesting. It's especially for the time, that was very, very controversial. So that's the thing. And it's cool. And it's again, we recommend it. Next, we actually recommend something not about the Holocaust specifically, but about the authoritarian state. And why they're dangerous. And it is the Introduction to Von Krieg by Colonel F.N. Mord of the Royal Engineers, who identifies basically why World War I is going to happen from a Clausewitzian point of view, and why this kind of fake, attention of arms was keeping the peace, and why that was in fact dangerous, and why basically no one could back down because they were in many ways too authoritarian. Now, you have to read a little bit in between the lines for that one, but we believe our audience to be intelligent enough to do so. But then, the other World War I piece that details in part why authoritarian states are dangerous and difficult is All Quiet on the Western Front. And we recommend this book because it brings the experiences of World War I to the point where you can understand why these states are later going to resume and basically World War I Part 2, that is to say World War II. and in effect why these states were so, racist and vitriol and all this other thing. And it kind of goes to both ways, right? Because you have the propaganda of the of the Entente saying that the Germans eat babies, and you have the German propaganda about the Russians being talked about, and why the Kaiser has to do everything that he's doing, and hypermasculinity in these authoritarian states, and why it's not a good thing. And that these are in fact, we think, educational reads on the subject for the author, for the listener, and a fairly good view on the author's kind of worldview. Paul Baumer, in this case, is a fictional character. So basically, Remarque wrote All Quiet on the Western Front based off his experiences. He's an actual World War I veteran. Paul Baumer was a fighter pilot in the German Air Force. He died, and supposedly the apocryphal stories that they knew each other, we don't actually know, but it's possible. I mean, it's awfully coincidental. So yes. This has been the Webo Bubble. This was not actually a rambling. This was much more targeted, we feel. And this has been the delineation of the theory of freedom, specifically, in this case, the freedom of speech. Thank you very much. Have a good day.